as we get everything all working here. So thanks again for joining. We're going to go till about 10:10 today. So I'll go relatively quickly. I'm also going to give a more expanded version of this tomorrow as well. So if you're here tomorrow, come on, join us, and we can have some deeper dive. My name is Jeff Luszcz. I am the founder of Palameda. So about 15 years ago, started a company that was designed to basically discover and manage both open source and commercial software libraries. So I've been working with large companies, small companies, open source software companies for 15 years, discovering and managing license problems and security problems. So what we're going to talk about today is common intake issues and how to resolve them. So we'll go through what is open source intake, what are some intake flows, what are some of the problems in the current process, major issues, vulnerabilities, and compliance issues. So the first thing is, what is open source intake? Basically, this is the process of obtaining open source or third-party software and bringing it into the application that you're building. It could be source code, it could be binary form, it could be an external resource, it could be an image, an icon, anything else that you didn't write. The process could be ad hoc, meaning your developers just do whatever they want to do. Or you can have a very monitored process. So we'll talk about the specifics today. So what are your common flows? Well, the old school way is to have a developer actually make a request before usage. So maybe a question here. Who here currently has any sort of intake flow process? Okay. And are you currently making your developers make requests beforehand? Okay. Anybody who just does it after the fact? Okay. This is the traditional way. This is where legal teams sat down and said, we need to look at every single library before it comes in, and we want to look and learn what it is, and then we're going to give a thumbs up or a thumbs down before we let you use it. That is the traditional way of managing open source. I think as time goes on, we're going to see that that is used less and less for the typical software package, but only for really specific and troublesome or hard to manage projects. One of the things that we see is there's literally hundreds to thousands of open source libraries that are being used every day in a typical product. And that kind of breaks down when you try to have a lawyer look at each individual library before it's brought in. So what also happens? Well, the most common thing is the developer just selects a library, a component, brings it into the code base, and says, I'm going to use this. Maybe they ask permission, maybe they tell somebody, maybe they don't, but that's what's happening every day. As we're sitting here right now, developers are coming into their offices, and they're going out to the internet, and they're downloading open source, they're downloading commercial SDKs, and it's now suddenly part of your product. The other thing that happens when your developers do that is they bring in that library, but they also bring in all the other libraries that component depends on. So kind of the subcomponent problem. And so you're required to manage all those licenses and all those compliance issues and security issues as well when you bring in that choice. And that kind of causes a fan-out problem. You bring in one item, what we see, the typical library brings in about 7 to 8 other subcomponents when you bring it in. Okay? You might be using a repository manager like Maven. And so when you do that, it kind of hides a lot of the subcomponent usage behind the scenes. Your developers pick something almost from a menu and says, I want to use this. And then everything else happens behind the scenes. It may be doing automatic upgrades for you. It may be bringing in the subcomponents and dependencies for you. And next thing you know, at build time, these items are being brought in. You might not see it in your source code management system, but your product will end up using it at build time. The repository manager brings in those dependencies as well. You also can bring in your commercial SDKs. And this is maybe becoming less and less as a thing as we use more and more open source dependencies. But especially in certain industries, IoT, healthcare, automotive, you're going to see a strong dependence on commercial SDKs and all the open source that are then brought in by those components as well. And then you're also going to see the IT infrastructure. So your developers are going to be picking certain open source libraries, and your IT teams are going to be picking infrastructure. We're going to use Amazon, we're going to use Google, we're going to use XYZ, or we're going to use this database, we're going to use these queues, or whatever it may be. All of these things are the ways that open source and other commercial code ends up in your product. So what are some of the problems? Well, the first thing is nobody really knows what you're using. I find that over the last 15 years I've worked with organizations, and the first thing that we do when we come in is we say, let's get your bill of materials together. And what that means, just like in a car, what are the screws and bolts and wires that go into your product? What is the software packages? What is the source code? What are the binaries that go into your product? That, at the heart of open source compliance is that process, figuring out basically your bill of materials. And most companies can't produce a bill of materials, and we'll talk a little bit about how that comes up. But basically, if you go back tomorrow and say, can we get a list of all the open source that we use? Most companies can't get a list. Or if they do, it's never been examined, it's never really been looked at. So that's at the heart of it, that's our job number one. Number two is there's really lack of controls and no ownership. If you go back to your company and say, who's responsible for open source? There's a lot of so-and-so is, or well, they are, but they actually never get asked questions, so-and-so. So that's a problem. There's a lack of institutional knowledge. I get called all the time when people say, what do we do about GPL with class path exception? Or what about this license versus that license? And there might be one or two people in the company that has that type of knowledge to make those decisions. Maybe it's your open source review board, maybe it's your legal team, maybe it's a really dedicated engineer. But in terms of managing this, we very often have these islands of knowledge, but then everybody else making decisions without that knowledge. We're going to have open source compliance failures. That means you ship a product, but you're not following all the obligations of the open source you're using. You have software vulnerabilities. We all saw what happened with Equifax last year. I think we're going to hear that comment over and over again today. But really, a lot of people have woken up to managing their open source, managing their third-party dependencies with security in mind. And then lastly, we don't see it as much these days, but export control issues, again, is a side effect of not managing your open source and third party, meaning you may have certain government regulations around the use of cryptography that you need to manage if you export something from your company and from your country. So let's talk first about vulnerabilities. I'm going to go through a few very specific intake issues and that have caused problems when people are trying to get their product out the door, they're trying to do a merger and acquisition, they're trying to release a product as open source itself. The first one that's on everybody's mind right now is around vulnerabilities. I think it's pretty, everybody knows the Equifax story, everybody knows what's going on in the world around managing these vulnerabilities, but at the heart of it, we use these third-party libraries, they get brought in to solve a problem, and then we leave them in the code base without updating or upgrading them. That leads to potentially software bugs that can lead to vulnerabilities. The most common intake issue here is that somebody picks a library, they don't know that the vulnerability exists, and you keep shipping your product that may have that vulnerability, or you have a software as a service site up that may be affected. Maybe it's the struts vulnerability like that affected Equifax, or maybe OpenSSL Heartbleed from a couple of years ago. The most common fix to this is just doing a simple upgrade. There was a bug that was discovered. Most people just say, oh, let's upgrade to the latest release. That is probably 80–90% of the fixes to most intake issues around vulnerabilities. That's pretty straightforward. Your developers are doing that each and every day. The thing that we may need to pay attention to is, has the license changed? Is there a compatibility issue? So sometimes people just will say willy-nilly, oh, just upgrade everything. But you move from version 2 of something to version 8 of something, the APIs are not going to be the same. Maybe the license changed between those two. So as managers of open source, wanting to make sure that we're doing the right thing around compliance and security, we need to pay attention to that. We also need to have our developers understand that just doing a simple upgrade, we need to pay attention to the licensing issues and the compatibility issues. And it's not something that typically you can just do at the last minute. There's a lot of burn-in tests and make-in tests that are required to preserve the compatibility side of things. You also may be able to do things that don't require a code change. Maybe it's firewall changes. Maybe it's simply upgrading the password. That was the default password was the vulnerability. You change the password. Those are the types of things that you want to ask your developers. How do we fix this issue? Do we fix it by upgrading it? Do we fix it by doing IT issues? And what is the side effects of upgrading it? I think the vast majority of issues here are going to be relatively straightforward. Upgrade your version, just make some subtle checks around the compatibility and the licensing, and away you go. What's the problem here? Is we still don't see people doing the upgrades that they need to do, especially when it involves a software supply chain, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I think is very important, if you don't know these open source libraries, and if you don't know these vulnerabilities like the back of your hand, it's something that I would recommend picking at least a couple of these and using these as your tests when you go talk to your developers. Are we using OpenSSL? Are we using struts? Are we using glibc? Are we using bash? This kind of hits the different types of software that we're shipping. Are we shipping Java software? Are we shipping something that's maybe embedded? Do we have a container or an operating system? And these are great bellwethers. If you get these right, it's not a sign that you're doing everything right, but it's a pretty good sign. If you get these wrong, they're typically so obvious that if you got them wrong, all the other less obvious stuff is probably being handled incorrectly as well. So these are great tests. I see in our work that most people have multiple-year-old versions of these, including OpenSSL. So it got fixed back in 2014 when everybody did their work around Heartbleed and hasn't been touched since for many organizations. There's been vulnerabilities every 6 weeks, every 3 months. It's a great test for your internal processes. One of the changes I've seen in the last year is that customers are starting to check themselves. They get your code, they get your product, or they take a look at what's out there on the website, and they run it through various scanner tools, or they're going to ask you questions about your inventory or bill of materials, and they're going to put tests to you. What version of struts do you use? What version of OpenSSL do you use? Or here's a laundry list of problems that we found in your product that we want you to go fix. Even if you're not affected by that vulnerability, you may be asked to fix it. And this is a very common thing you'll hear from your developers. Developers will say, yeah, we were aware of that vulnerability, but it doesn't affect us. But you then now have to go talk to your customers and say, yes, we understand that. Yes, we use that library. Yes, we use that version, but we're not affected by that vulnerability. And that really is a big trust issue. And a lot of times it's true. Yeah, we're not affected. Trust us. More often than not, I think what you're going to find is your customers are going to say, well, that's great, but we just want to see this go away. We want to strike everything that's on this red list. Please get rid of it. So I'm seeing that pressure coming from the customers more and more. I also see the developers pushing back and saying we're not affected, but this getting overruled by sales and marketing when it comes to just cleaning out that list. The other thing that's surprising to some people is when you do this intake process, your developers say, I want to use this library of this version, and you check to make sure that it doesn't have any vulnerabilities in it. You get a clean bill of health. You then are using it for one month, 1 year, 2 years. It ages out. People find vulnerabilities in that version, and you now have to pay attention and fix that. A lot of companies are just paying attention to the top of tree. They're saying as things get requested by developers, we'll do the test, but they're not checking to see what's as part of your installed base or deployed application. And this is where people sometimes will get embarrassed because their head of tree is clean, but their customers are scanning what's actually on their hard drives or installed on their systems, and they're seeing 6-month-old problems or a year-old or 2-year-old problems. So be ready for that. It also comes in through your support list. You'll actually have your support team getting requests for vulnerability management from the field. And they very often this is an unexpected request to them. They know how to handle, I can't print, I can't log in. They don't often know who to go contact around vulnerability issues or perceived vulnerability issues. So something to go take a look on with your support team. How would they handle this? Do they know who to contact in your company? And do you have a canned response around managing this? The next thing is around the supply chain. There are very few companies that just build their products just based on things that their developers decide to use. That's small companies, maybe small libraries themselves, but most companies are finding themselves involved in a very long supply chain. And what the software supply chain is anybody who builds software that you use, maybe it's wrapped in some functionality, maybe it's wrapped in a commercial wrapper, and then it's passed on from company to company or organization to organization until finally your team brings it in. And the supply chain is getting longer and longer. And if you're in certain industries, if you're in the automotive industry, healthcare, IoT, you have an extremely long supply chain. If you're in the financial industries, you have a supply chain as well. We're hearing from some of the suppliers today about here's a commercial company, it comes into this organization, it then gets wrapped and put on GitHub. Your developers then pick it and use it, and so on and so on. And this is a great thing. It's basically showing the community around us. It's showing many hands help us. But your supply chain doesn't always have your best interest at heart, or your supply chain may not care about what your business model is or what your problems or what your customer requests are. They're building open source. They're building commercial code. And especially if they're 3 levels down in your supply chain, a panicked phone call on Friday at 5 o'clock isn't really going to make them jump in and help you. You need to understand where your dependencies are. You need to understand how you work with them, how do you contact with them, and the types of issues that may come up. And so the intake issues we see around the supply chain is, number one, is you need to understand who your supply chain is and understand the further you go back, the less likely they are able to help you. They may not, there may be language issues, there may be contractual issues, there may be just, hey, I'm sorry you have a problem, but I'm an open source developer. I don't know how to fix your issue, or I don't know how to answer your export control questionnaire, and I'm not going to fill in your RFP for you. These are the types of things that we hear when companies try to push some of this compliance tasks to their supply chain. What's currently not happening? The software supply chain is not giving the bill of materials and proper disclosures to the companies who are depending on them. So again, if you go and bring in an SDK or an open source library and you say, where's the open source disclosures? Maybe an SPDX file, maybe a license notices file. Many of those projects still are not providing that information to you as a user. They should, and this is where your organization can kind of push back on the supply chain and say, we really need your open source disclosures to be correct. We need your vulnerabilities to be checked, whether it's on a commercial supplier, whether it's an open source supplier. If you can build that as part of your intake process, it's a lot easier for you when you have a problem to look at your list and say, oh, we're good. We have a bill of materials for this organization. We know that these people are doing vulnerability scanning or vulnerability management. These are not. We need to take care of this ourselves. But put the pressure on that. And what I try to say here is make this more of a push, not a pull process. Right now it's a pull process. We go yell at our commercial suppliers, we go yell at our open source suppliers and say, I need this, you need to give this to me. We really want that to be a push process where they're pushing the bill of materials to you, they're pushing the compliance documents, they're pushing vulnerability updates to you. So you just are waiting for the proper things to happen. Test the supply chain. I showed that list of well-known vulnerabilities before. Those are great tests, whether from a compliance perspective or vulnerability perspective. If they're getting those wrong, they're going to get everything else wrong. And these are great tests. But you are responsible for what you deliver. So if you're shipping a product, if you're distributing something, that the buck stops with you. You can't. We see a lot of companies say, "Oh, our supplier caused that problem." Legally, and probably from your customers as well, they don't care about that you picked a supplier four companies ago on the supply chain, and they're giving you a GPL violation or a struts problem. They're looking at you and say, we want your processes correct. We want you're responsible. We paid you for this product, or we're depending on you to fix this for us. The supply chain is one of the things I think you need to have your security team, your sales team, your marketing team, your legal team, all singing the same song. This is something that's going to affect your contracts. It's going to affect how you reach out of the organization. And it can take a little while. There's some talks around the open chain process, which I'd recommend taking a look at today or tomorrow. There's some great documentation and processes there around how you work with your supply chain, and you can be a good member of your supply chain as well. One of the things I always like to mention in these talks is around education and process. And we may be a little biased here. If you've come to a talk around open source compliance and security, that's the companies who say, yes, we have great process, we have great education. Most people are not in this talk or the other talks today. They don't have great education. If you go to the typical line level developer and ask them specific questions about open source licensing, security, et cetera, you may be shocked just by, they're great Java developers, they're great JavaScript developers. They don't understand the intake issues. They don't understand the license issues. And if they did get trained on it, it was when at the same time they were doing their retirement benefits, their healthcare benefits, and it was just another training they clicked next on, they passed it, and they moved on. This is something, I don't think you can do enough training around open source. The universities are currently not doing enough on this. I think companies are not doing enough about this. And it only, a little ounce of prevention fixes a big remediation problem later on. Management and legal often comes in too late to really add a lot of help here. It's an emergency. Somebody says, oh, we're selling this. We just signed a contract that says we're going to give a list of all our open source disclosures to a company, and it's supposed to be done on Tuesday. and it's Monday, and legal gets brought in because there's no documentation, there's no process. And when they do it, they find a bunch of vulnerabilities, or they find a bunch of licensing problems. And now they're in this case where contractually we have to deliver this list of disclosures, but management is saying, you told me 24 hours before it's due, now what do we do? And this leads to ethical problems, this leads to kind of customer happiness issues. So again, educate your developers, educate your legal team, your security teams, your sales team about how long it takes to do these things and what can we do to make this process a little better. And you're also going to find that these processes are sometimes kept secret. Hey, we have a Gpl violation, an open source violation. We have a security problem. Those things are often hidden away because you don't want to scare your customers. You don't want to scare your developers, or maybe there's a perceived legal privilege thing. And so it makes it harder for everybody in the company to understand, how do we fix these things? How do we deal with these things? And I think the more we can talk about this, the more we can educate our developers, the better and easier this process gets. So let's talk some specific things. You guys are going to go back to your companies. You're going to start looking at your bill of materials. You're going to start looking at your vulnerability lists. And some things are pretty straightforward. What do? We remove something. We upgrade something. We kill a feature. Those are the most common things, remediation or fixes, that you're going to see to open source intake issues or vulnerabilities. Just remove the feature, delete that part of the product. That's the pretty straightforward thing. There's some things that are a lot harder. So I'm going to go through about 5 or 6 of the issues that I have found have really stopped merger and acquisitions, released software shipments and delivery, and also has caused problems with the sales process. So probably one of the biggest issues that we see here is around Gpl violations, or using copyleft, these strong licenses that basically say, if you're shipping a product and you're using content under these open source licenses, the expectation is you're going to give away the source code to the product, anything that links to it. And it's a great license. It's what is underneath the Linux kernel, a lot of the tools that we use in the Linux runtime. At the heart of every car is 100 million lines of GPL'd source code. But many of us are working at commercial companies who want to keep things closed and proprietary. And these licenses might be in conflict with that business model. And so what you're going to find is your developers, if they don't understand what the licenses mean, they're going to make the right technical choice. They're going to pick a library that fixes their technical problem, but it might have a license that's contrary to your policy. So the most common thing we're going to see here is you're going to say, we can't use this library anymore. We need to remove it. We need to basically build this feature again. That's the most common response. I'll say one of the things I've seen is that there are some things that you can do if you have a little bit of time. If you've signed a contract and you have to fix this thing in a week, you're probably going to go the route of delete and rewrite. But you have a couple other options. So some of these licenses actually have a commercial alternative. You can go talk to the original author and say, I'd like to buy a commercial license. Is that possible? That can happen in some cases, but not in all. For example, you can't go to the Linux kernel community and say, I want to buy a commercial license. This is not physically possible due to how they've done their licensing. For single authors, small organizations, open source organizations, may be possible. Maybe you just open source your product. Maybe this is something you say, we don't need to keep this thing closed. Let's open source it. We're going to get some great value from being an open source company, especially if it's just part of your core infrastructure. It's not seen as having a lot of trade secrets and things like that. Your developers may say, I can rebuild this. I can rewrite this. I want to caution you on that. I've not seen a lot of great clean room development in a rush. So somebody says, we have this GPL library. Trust me, I can fix it. And you get back something that looks just like that original library, but they stripped the copyrights, they've changed some of the variable names and things like that. So you want to make sure you don't do dirty room development. You want to do clean room development if you do a rewrite. And I would say in most cases, rewriting is not a great solution except for some pretty small routines here and there. GPL issues are probably, if you're not shipping software, you may not be concerned as much about this. But I also see that more and more people are starting to build containers. And they're starting to build not just SaaS products, but they're going to deliver things in containers, just like we used to do with virtual machines or real machines. And the GPL issues are starting to come back. We did SaaS for a while, but we're now starting to see people wanting to distribute more things in containers and give it for on-premises. And that's a classic distribution. We have to pay attention to the GPL issues again. Where you are in the stack is also very important. If you're building an IoT system, you're building a container system, you're going to have your operating system, your kernel, things like that. It's all going to be GPL. Perfect. That's exactly what we're looking for. And as you get to your proprietary product at the top, you want probably less and less GPL up there if you're going to keep things closed source. So one thing I've seen with intake issues is some companies say no GPL allowed whatsoever. Then you have your developers trying to figure out how they're supposed to actually release their containers or the operating systems and things like that. So you can't just have a simplistic no GPL policy. You need to have a policy that reflects reality. You also will find sometimes that people hear that you're allowed to use GPL down here, and they think that they're allowed to use it up in the proprietary piece. And again, this is where these intake issues come out. So you need to talk not just about licensing, you need to talk about how that product is used. A thing that's closely related to this is around dual licensing. So many of the libraries that are out there give you a choice of license. I can use maybe a GPL license or maybe a separate type of license. And there's really two cases that we see out there. One is around business models. Somebody says, I want to make money using my open source, so I put it out there under a GPL license, but I also give you an option of buying a commercial license. MySQL, iText, these are two very common libraries that you're going to see out there that your developers are just going to download. It's open source, it's freely available. By default, it's under a general public license, which has all the concerns that we talked about in the last set of slides. If you're going to end up distributing this, you can purchase a commercial license as part of their business model, and then it's just another piece of commercial licensed software for you. What happens a lot of times, you find about this after the fact. You've already been shipping something and you have to then pay for things that may be in the field. What do? You can purchase a commercial license, you can release the product as open source, which is less likely, or you can remove the component and maybe find something else that provides a work-alike functionality under a different license. You will find this traditionally around databases. You'll find this around maybe some of the other parts of your infrastructure. But in general, whenever you see that you're using a database, first question you should be asked is, is this a dual licensed database? This is MongoDB, MySQL, BerkeleyDB. These are all companies that have been wrapped around this, and they've built a licensing model on that. Another dual license that you're also going to see, especially in the Java community, is where they're giving basically choices of licensing ecosystems. Maybe if you like GPL, you can use it under GPL. If you like Apache, you can use it under Apache. The intake issue here is that sometimes people get scared away because they see that GPL is in the license list. And the developers say, oh, I can't use it because of our policy. They don't always understand that they have a choice. Or that certain things are going to use like the CUDL, the CDDL license, or the GPL under class path exception. These are all very common in the Java world. And it's a little bit harder for people to understand because it's a little more complicated. GPL with class path exception. What does that mean compared to just classic GPL? Or if I see that I have a choice of this or that. So again, this is part of the education. But even some of the legal folks that I've worked with, they say, well, do I like CUDL or do I like Apache? What's our preference? So looking at your community, if you're a Java shop, you should really understand the CDDL license. You should really understand the GPL2 with class path exception. These are probably going to, I'm not a lawyer, but I see that is very commonly used inside of companies. But I also see that sometimes they'll shy away. They see the magic word GPL, they don't see it, they see that as an exception, and they delete something that was probably perfectly acceptable to use inside their company. Another issue, and I'll pick on one organization here just as an example of others, is Stack Overflow. This is a great forum and question and answer site that's out there right now, but this causes some of the biggest compliance discussions among the legal teams that I work with because a couple of reasons. Number one is there's a lot of code that's coming in from the outside. Your developers are going out to Stack Overflow, they're asking questions, or they're seeing the same question that they have. There's a nice chunk of code that fixes the problem that they have. But the issue is all the code on Stack Overflow is under a viral license. It's under a Creative Commons share-alike license, which is, I'll say it's somewhat similar to the GPL in the sense of that it's more of a viral license. The problem is that developers are all going out there and grabbing this code. And this leads to this problem where your development team is saying everybody in the world is using this code. Are we going to be the company that doesn't use Stack Overflow? And your legal team is saying, well, we know for sure it's under a Creative Commons share-alike license. We can't use that. That's contrary to our policy. And it leads to this clash. And it's a class that shouldn't be there, but unfortunately it is. So I think for the next couple of years, we're going to have to deal with this. So there's a couple things you can do. You can always remove the code. Your developers are going to say, why do I have to do this? Everybody else is using this. But that is something I see a lot of companies do. You can rewrite the code. Be careful of that dirty room that we talked about before. But the most common thing that I see people do is actually the legal team reaching out to the Stack Overflow author, explaining the situation, and saying, can we relicense this code? Can you give this to us under maybe Apache 2.0 or MIT license? And they typically have the rights to relicense that code and say, yeah, of course, I didn't understand that this was an issue for you. What do you want? And I strongly recommend you tell them the license that you want. We prefer stuff under Apache 2.0 or MIT or whatever your favorite inbound license is. 9 times out of 10, you'll get a nice reply through the Stack Overflow chat system. Says, of course, yes, here, you have my permissions, and then you can put that in your doc. But do beware of some ownership issues. If they're just taking code off of Microsoft's MSDN and putting it up on Stack Overflow, first off, they don't have the permission to relicense it under share alike anyway, and they also definitely can't give it to you at MIT. So you might need to do a little diligence in terms of where that code came from. But this is something that's kind of an annoying compliance issue. But the legal teams I work with, they say, well, we can't have people disrespecting the open source licenses. If they ignore this license, what other licenses are we teaching them to ignore? And it's something I think we just need to deal with some training and maybe continuing to work with the community there. Okay, this is very related to cut and pastes. Developers are going out, they're finding solutions to their problems. Sometimes they're bringing in entire libraries. Other times they find a good chunk of code. So if you're not familiar with some of these things, basically again, they'll go out to Stack Overflow, they'll find something from a larger library that they like, they'll cut and paste it into it, and very often they lose the copyright statements, they lose the license text. You want to bring that back in. You want to make sure that the copyright text is preserved. You want to make sure the license text is preserved. You also want to make sure that the license is appropriate for the way you're using it. So first thing is you want to identify that that's a cut and paste. You might see the developers giving credit where credit's due. You might see where it says stolen from and then some website or thanks to. And they're not saying really they stole it, but they're giving credit where credit's due, but the lawyers hate to see those words in the code base there. So try to work with your team. Have a policy for cutting and pasting. Have a policy so that everybody knows that if they're taking something from the outside, that you want to track it. You should be careful of, there's these things called gists, G-I-S-T. It's out there on GitHub. There's some others, forums, etc. They often lack the copyright and license notice right there and there in the code from the original code itself. But developers should understand anytime they use cut and paste, anytime they bring in something from the outside, you want to know where it came from, who wrote it, what the license is, and what the permissions are. And the standard remediation tasks that are there as well. And one thing to be careful is anytime you see a cut and paste, usually that's something that's going to be statically linked into your final product. And we'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. But linkage issues can be fairly complicated, especially around LGPL and GPL. And that you can have a whole conference on linking issues here. But that's another question. When you see certain licenses, that may affect your permissions to use it. Okay. One thing we're seeing more and more is people depending on external web services, REST APIs, and things like that. And at an open source conference, there may not be any source code here, but it's a third-party dependency that often will come in that you need to manage and detect. With the GDPR, more and more people are getting concerned around this because this is a place where your customer data may be coming into your company and leaving your company. So tracking every place where things are coming in from the outside and leaving is an important compliance and security task these days. This is also a sign that you can figure out more about what your supply chain is. What is this company? What if this company goes down? Do you have a service level agreement with them? What are the terms of use? And things that work great in development, they may be hitting it 200 times a day, suddenly breaks when you push it out to production and you're calling this web service 1,000,000 times a day, and they shut you off, and your big new feature is killed. We've seen some things here. It's very often used in things like currency lookups, GIS and geography lookups, mapping, time services. A couple years ago, Netgear had a big problem where they embedded a web service in a physical device that they couldn't upgrade in the field. And it basically took the University of Wisconsin down because it was hitting on a device that was a time server that was there. And they've ended up having to pay about almost $400,000 to help out that university to mitigate this problem. So if you're doing SaaS, it may be a little easier for you to fix that issue after a day or two. If you're making an IoT product or something healthcare related, you may not be able to fix that in the field, so you need to pay attention to that. And there's some things you can do around detecting this. You might want to use something like Wireshark. Watch the actual content that's going over the wire as you're doing this. Do some code scanning, talk to your developers. Another thing that we see that hits compliance issues is multimedia. So images, icons, fonts, things like that. Again, have your policy in place, have your developers understand that these things are real issues. We also see that this sometimes will come up as part of the open source products. So you're using a library, it's great, it's under an MIT license, but then you see all the artwork is under share alike, Creative Commons problem. Or maybe it's coming from a company that sells clip art and you haven't paid for it. So these are things that come up, especially in the commercial and the SaaS organizations, where you start to see all our button icons came from an open source product under a license that we can't use, or the commercial images from our standard set. So again, it's a resource that needs to be tracked. And that brings us, last 2 minutes here, around our subcomponent issues. We're starting to see more and more people start to look inside of the open source that they're using. So they look at the top level license and they say, we love MIT, we love BSD, we love Apache 2.0. Then they look inside and they see GPL. They see Creative Commons share alike. They see unpaid for commercial. And this is one of those things where companies say, well, is it our job to fix this? Is it the open source products' job to fix this? And I think at the heart of it, the buck stops with you. If you're shipping something, you're responsible for it. I do see that companies are struggling with this. This is something where you do need to work with the foundations. You need to work with the individual open source teams that you're getting the code from. Identify what these issues are. Log these as defects as an IP defect on their GitHub or wherever they're doing their development. Explain why it's important. You may need to make your own fork of this issue. If you're using a library and there's a big problematic thing down there, you may need to make your own version of the open source product for a little while until they fix the issue. You may then find yourself not getting the same vulnerability fixes and whatnot, so you need to really manage whether you really want to take that on or not. And in general, the whole ecosystem has these types of issues. So there may be certain foundations where code from them may be more well vetted, so you're going to less likely have these. If you have something from an university student who's out there on the web, they might not be paying attention as much to the subcomponent issues as somebody like Apache or FINOS, et cetera. Okay, let me just skip to one last issue here before we have to drop to get back on stage here, is around compliance issues. So around the attribution issues. So your customers are going to ask you for your bill of materials. They're going to ask you for your attributions and statements in your about box and your documentation. And most organizations are doing a really bad job about keeping track of this. So you want to make sure that you're providing the right license text. But especially if you're using something like Maven or other repository managers, sometimes they just simply say MIT. That's not the license text. That's just the name of the license. And if you go out to the, what types of MIT licenses out there, there's more than 22 variants of the MIT license out there with different legal text, different license text. So you just can't simply take the code and put the random text in. You have to talk to the author. So the last thing I'll leave you with today is it never hurts to reach out to the authors. They are the owners of the IP, they're the owners of the open source. They tell you what's really the license. They tell you what's really the policy around it. So do that, reach out to them. Don't make up your own license text when you go to see simply MIT. And if they don't answer you, you may need to do the classic remediation steps. So I'll leave you with that today. I'm available to talk afterward, and I have an expanded version of this tomorrow. So thanks so much. Appreciate it.